The year was 1888, and on the rolling outskirts of a small Virginia town, the Hargrove Mansion loomed against the horizon, its tall columns and brick facade, once the pride of a wealthy plantation family, had long since fallen into disrepair. Weather had peeled away the paint, the windows were cracked, and ivy clung stubbornly to the crumbling walls. For the townsfolk below, it was no longer a place of grandeur, but a hushed reminder of a past era, whispered about as a haunted relic. Yet for a group of forgotten children, the mansion was not haunted, it was home. They came there not by choice, but by necessity. The late 1800s were unforgiving years. Epidemics of cholera and influenza swept through rural communities, leaving many children without parents. Industrial accidents claimed fathers working on railroads, and poverty left widowed mothers unable to provide. The result was a steady trickle of boys and girls with no one to turn to. One by one, they found their way to the hill. The mansion's empty rooms became their refuge. The grand dining hall, once filled with candlelight and laughter, now housed makeshift beds of straw and ragged blankets. The library, with shelves still holding dusty volumes of philosophy and law, became a school where the older children would show the younger how to trace letters using bits of chalk stolen from town. The once sparkling ballroom, with its cracked mirrors and warped wooden floor, became a place where children gathered in the evenings, huddling together for warmth around a small fire built in an old iron pan. Life inside was not easy. The roof leaked during heavy rains, forcing them to move beds from room to room. Winters were brutal. The thin walls offered little protection against the biting cold. The orphans survived on scraps, day-old bread left behind by sympathetic bakers, bruised apples from the market, or potatoes dug from nearby fields. The older boys learned to fish in the river, while the girls mended clothes from discarded fabric, sewing by candle stubs. Hunger was a constant companion, but so was resilience. Despite their suffering, the children built their own fragile world. There was no adult to lead them, no guardian to enforce rules, but somehow they formed a family. The eldest, a boy named Samuel, only 15, took on the role of protector. He organized chores, ensuring water was drawn from the well and firewood was stacked for the night. Mary, a quiet 12-year-old with a gift for storytelling, comforted the younger ones by spinning tales before bedtime, reminding them that even the smallest life had meaning. Thomas, barely 10, discovered a talent for patching shoes, learning to hammer nails into leather scraps until the shoes were strong enough for the muddy roads. Together, they carried the weight of survival. The townsfolk below, however, rarely looked up to the hill with kindness. To them, the children were little more than phantoms, a reminder of hardship they preferred not to see. Farmers whispered about the mansion ghosts, scaring their own children from wandering too far. Shopkeepers often turned away the orphans when they begged for bread, fearing they might attract pity seekers. Some even argued that the children should be sent to workhouses in the city. But the orphans clung to each other, refusing to give up. They created their own system of hope, small though it was. On Sundays, when the church bells rang from town, the children gathered on the mansion's broken steps. Without hymn books, they hummed together, letting the sound rise into the sky. For them, it was not just a song. It was a promise that their lives, though overlooked, still had worth. As winter set in during late 1888, conditions grew dire, food grew scarce, snow piled against the doors, and illnesses spread among the children. Yet even then, they discovered ways to endure. Samuel would walk 5 miles into town to trade bundles of firewood for flour. Mary taught the youngest to pray, not because she expected miracles, but because hope was the one thing they could not afford to lose. And when the firewood was nearly gone, the children tore up old, broken furniture from the mansion itself, burning the past to keep the present alive. The mansion on the hill, though broken and cold, became a symbol of something far greater than its decaying bricks. It was a place where children, abandoned by society, learned the strength of unity. They had no parents, no wealth, and no security, yet they discovered a truth that even the town below had forgotten, that survival is not merely about food and shelter, but about faith in one another. Every cracked wall and leaking roof told their story, not of despair, but of determination. What others saw as ruins, they saw as refuge. Where others saw ghosts, they saw family, and though the mansion still stood in shadows, the light inside those children could not be extinguished. It was the kind of light that would, in time, catch the eye of a stranger passing by, someone who would change their fate forever. The children of Hargrove Mansion did not cry loudly for help, nor did they march into town demanding aid. They had learned painfully that the world rarely listened to the voices of the forgotten. Their lives were carried out in silence, a silence born not only from fear of rejection, but also from the dignity of survival. Inside the vast, echoing halls of the mansion, the orphans lived with a rhythm all their own. The mornings began with cold drafts sweeping through broken windows, chilling the air enough to wake even the heaviest sleeper. The older children stirred first, rubbing numb hands together, their breath visible in the winter months. Samuel, always the leader, would shake the younger ones awake with gentle insistence, urging them to rise before the sunlight slipped too far. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was meager. A piece of bread, hard and stale, was broken carefully into equal portions. On fortunate days, a child might return from the edge of town with bruised fruit or a handful of potatoes scavenged from a field. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, for they did not know when the next morsel might come. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, yet they endured, teaching one another the art of patience. But food was not their only struggle. Illness lurked in the shadows of the mansion. Without proper care, even a simple cough could spiral into fever. The children used what remedies they knew: ragged cloths soaked in cool water, teas brewed from wild herbs, and whispered prayers whispered in the dark. When one child grew weak, the others took turns keeping watch, refusing to let their sibling fade alone. Though they had no doctor, they had devotion, and in their devotion, a kind of healing. Clothing was another battle. The garments they wore were not tailored for them, but stitched together from cast-offs found in town. Mary, with her steady hands, patched trousers with scraps of fabric and mended torn sleeves with mismatched thread. Shoes were handed down until they fell apart, leaving little feet raw and blistered from the stony roads. Yet, when one child outgrew a coat, it was passed immediately to another. Nothing belonged to one alone, everything belonged to all. Education, too, was a silent struggle. The mansion still held shelves of dusty books, law journals, ledgers, and old volumes of poetry, but most of the children could not read them. Determined not to remain in ignorance, they invented their own school. Samuel, who remembered the alphabet from his father's lessons before tragedy struck, scrawled letters on scraps of wood with bits of charcoal. The younger ones copied them on the floor, their fingers smudged black with effort. Mary read aloud from any page she could decipher, turning faded words into lessons of resilience. Though their classroom lacked chalkboards and desks, it was alive with the hunger for knowledge. What made their struggles heavier was the indifference of the town below. The orphans rarely descended the hill together, for the townsfolk looked upon them with suspicion. When Samuel once asked for work in exchange for food, a shopkeeper dismissed him with a harsh laugh. "Go back to your ghosts on the hill." Such words cut deeply, but Samuel swallowed the sting, knowing his pride was not as important as his siblings' survival. So they learned to move quietly, in pairs or alone. They ventured into town at dawn, when fewer eyes watched. They carried bundles of kindling to trade for pennies, gathered scraps of metal to sell, and sometimes sang on the street corners, hoping their voices would soften a passerby's heart. But more often than not, they returned with little to show. Still, they never returned empty-handed in spirit. They carried with them the silent lesson that even rejection could not break them. Despite the hardships, there were moments of quiet joy hidden within their struggles. At night, after the chores were done, and the fire flickered weakly in the iron pan, the children gathered close. Mary told stories, weaving tales of knights, brave girls, and faraway lands where no child was ever hungry or forgotten. Laughter would ripple through the group, thin but genuine, as the younger ones drifted into dreams. In those moments, the silence of neglect was replaced by the sound of belonging. But the silence was not only external, it was also the silence of their dreams unspoken. Each child carried within them a wish too fragile to voice aloud. Thomas, who mended shoes with scraps, dreamed of becoming a cobbler with a shop of his own. Mary, whose words comforted others, longed to be a teacher. Even Samuel, strong though he appeared, dreamed secretly of living in a world where he did not have to bear so heavy a burden alone. They did not shout these dreams into the world, for the world had already turned its back. Instead, they held them in silence, nurturing them like embers waiting for the wind. In truth, the silence was both their prison and their strength. It was silence that kept them invisible to those who might separate them into workhouses. It was silence that allowed them to build their fragile family without interference. But it was also silence that kept them from receiving the compassion they so desperately needed. The children of Hargrove Mansion struggled in silence, not because they lacked voices, but because they knew their voices carried little weight in a world that prized wealth over humanity. Yet within that silence, they forged bonds stronger than iron. Their suffering taught them endurance, their hunger taught them sharing, their sickness taught them care, and their neglect taught them unity. One day their silence would be broken, by a stranger who would listen, by a community that would finally awaken. But until that day, they endured quietly, bravely, and together. And though no one in town could hear it, the silence of Hargrove Mansion was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken determination of children who refused to give up. Children who were, in truth, writing their own story of survival. The winter of 1888 pressed heavily upon the town, its snowdrifts piling high along fences and roads. For the children in Hargrove Mansion, the cold was a merciless enemy. Their small fire often dwindled to embers before dawn, leaving them shivering beneath thin blankets. Hunger bit deeper than ever, for fields were barren and scraps from the market grew scarce. It was in the heart of this unforgiving season that a woman named Clara Reynolds first climbed the hill. Clara was not a wealthy woman, nor was she born into privilege. She was a schoolteacher, 30 years old, plain in appearance but warm in spirit. Having lost her own parents as a teenager, she had learned early the pain of being unseen. Though she now lived a modest life renting a room in town, she carried within her a firm belief no soul is too small to matter. That December morning, Clara had been walking home from visiting a sick student when she noticed a thin column of smoke rising faintly from the direction of the mansion. Curious and troubled, she paused. The townsfolk often called the mansion haunted, a place of spirits and misfortune, but Clara had never trusted gossip. Something in her heart urged her up the slope. The climb was difficult, the snow heavy around her boots, but soon the great mansion stood before her. Its windows, broken and dark, stared like hollow eyes. Yet the faint trace of smoke told her there was life within. She knocked softly at the heavy door. For a long moment, there was no reply. Then the door creaked open, and a boy's wary face appeared. It was Samuel. His eyes, sharp and guarded, studied her with suspicion. He had learned too well the cruelty of adults who dismissed orphans as burdens. Behind him, Clara glimpsed pale faces. Children huddled together, wide-eyed and cautious. Her heart tightened at the sight of them. "I'm Clara Reynolds," she said gently, her voice carrying no judgment. "I'm a teacher in town. I've saw your smoke. May I come in?" Samuel hesitated, torn between mistrust and need, but the bitter wind behind Clara reminded him of the younger children shivering inside. At last, he stepped aside. The moment Clara entered, the truth struck her like a blow. The grand halls of Hargrove Mansion were crumbling, yet more painful than the ruin was the condition of its inhabitants. Thin arms and legs poked from tattered clothes. Coughs rattled in the air. A small girl clutched a broken doll, her cheeks hollow with hunger. Clara had seen poverty before, but never so concentrated, never so invisible to those around her. Her first act was not to speak, but to listen. She sat with Samuel, Mary, and the others as they cautiously told their stories. Parents lost to disease, families broken by poverty, children abandoned with nowhere else to go. Each voice was soft, uncertain, as if afraid their suffering was too shameful to share. But Clara's eyes never left theirs, and in her gaze was something they had rarely seen: respect. That night, she returned to her small room in town with a heavy heart. She could have chosen to push their faces from her mind, as so many others had done. Yet the memory of their trembling bodies haunted her. She resolved that she would return, not once but again and again. The very next day, Clara carried a basket up the hill. Inside was fresh bread, a jar of broth, and several blankets she had stitched from old cloth. The children stared at her in disbelief as she laid the food upon their table. Mary, overcome with emotion, whispered, "Is this for us?" Clara nodded, smiling through tears, but her compassion did not end with food and warmth. Clara understood that survival meant more than filling stomachs. It meant filling spirits. She began teaching them each evening by candlelight. With chalk she purchased from her own wages, she showed the children how to shape letters on scraps of wood. She read them simple stories, their eyes widening at worlds beyond their hardship. When Thomas traced his first word, hope, his grin lit the dim room brighter than any fire. At first, the children remained cautious. Years of neglect had taught them to expect betrayal. But Clara's persistence broke down their walls. She came whether the weather was kind or cruel, whether her own purse was full or thin. Slowly, the children began to believe perhaps not all adults turned away. Samuel, who had carried responsibility far beyond his years, found in Clara not only a helper but a guide. She reminded him that being strong did not mean being alone. Mary, the storyteller, learned to write down her tales, discovering the joy of putting her imagination onto paper. Even the youngest, who had once shrunk from strangers, began to run to the door when Clara arrived, eager for her embrace. Clara's presence marked the beginning of a transformation, not only in the mansion but in the children themselves. They began to laugh more freely, to dream more boldly. Though hunger and cold remained, they no longer carried their burdens in silence. They had found someone willing to listen. Word of Clara's visits spread quietly through town. Some scoffed at her, calling her foolish for wasting time on the mansion ghosts. But others began to soften. When people saw her trudging through snow with baskets, their curiosity grew. If a single school teacher could care so deeply, perhaps the orphans deserved more than whispers and neglect. For Clara, compassion was not a grand gesture, but a steady offering of presence. She knew she could not erase their suffering overnight, but she could plant seeds of hope. And seeds, when nurtured, had a way of growing beyond expectation. The children would never forget the first time she looked at them not with pity, but with belief. In that moment they ceased to be invisible. They were no longer just the forgotten orphans of Hargrove Mansion. They were children, worthy of love, worthy of learning, worthy of life itself. And it all began because one stranger dared to climb the hill, knock on a broken door, and listen. When Clara Reynolds first stepped into Hargrove Mansion, she was met not only with poverty but with walls of suspicion. The children, though desperate for food and warmth, had learned to mistrust promises. Adults had looked away too many times before. Trust, for them, was not something given freely. It had to be earned piece by piece. Clara understood this. She did not demand their affection, nor insist on gratitude. Instead, she kept showing up, day after day, climbing the hill with her basket, her books, and her steady voice. Her constancy was the first stone laid in the fragile bridge of trust. At first, the orphans treated her kindness with caution. When Clara taught the alphabet on the cracked library table, some children sat at a distance, watching in silence. When she brought soup, Samuel tasted it first before passing bowls to the younger ones, ensuring no harm would come. Their lives had been marked by disappointments. They could not yet believe this stranger's intentions were pure. But time has a way of softening even the hardest fears. When Clara noticed one child's shoes worn to threads, she quietly brought another pair the following week. When Mary fell sick with fever, Clara stayed through the night, applying cool cloths to her brow until the fever broke. When Samuel struggled with the weight of leadership, Clara reminded him gently that being strong did not mean being alone. The children began to realize Clara was not coming once out of pity. She was coming because she saw them. Slowly, the mansion itself began to echo with a new sound, laughter mixed with learning. Clara transformed the dusty library into a classroom. With chalk and scraps of wood, she taught letters, numbers, and even the rhythm of poetry. Mary, who had always told stories aloud, now learned to write them down. Her shaky letters formed sentences, and her tales of knights and brave heroines became treasures for the group. Thomas, the boy who mended shoes, learned to measure and count, his dreams of becoming a cobbler sharpening into possibility. Even the youngest children traced shapes with chubby fingers, giggling as Clara guided their hands. Education was not just knowledge, it was dignity. Each new word written, each sum solved, was proof that they were more than shadows in a broken mansion. They were children capable of growth, worthy of a future. Perhaps the greatest change came in their voices. The orphans had once carried their burdens in silence, fearing that speaking their dreams aloud would invite disappointment. But Clara encouraged them to share, asking simple questions. What do you wish for? What do you hope to become? At first, their answers were hesitant, whispered like secrets. Samuel admitted he wished to be a builder, to repair homes so others would not live in ruins. Mary confessed her dream of teaching, inspired by Clara herself. Thomas wanted his own workshop, where no child would go barefoot. One little girl, barely 7, said she only dreamed of always being warm. Clara listened to every word as though it were sacred, and in listening, she gave them permission to believe their dreams had value. The children, in turn, began to mirror Clara's kindness. Samuel, once hardened by responsibility, started sharing his own burdens, trusting her guidance. Mary began teaching the younger children to read even when Clara was absent, carrying forward the gift she had been given. Thomas used his shoe mending skills to patch not only his own shoes but everyone's, proud of his usefulness. Even their play transformed. Where once they had huddled only for warmth, now they played simple games, chasing each other through the grand, crumbling halls. They decorated one corner of the ballroom with scraps of colored fabric Clara brought, turning it into their festival hall. For the first time, laughter echoed through rooms that had long been silent. Clara's visits did not go unnoticed in town. Curious neighbors asked why she spent her evenings trudging up the hill. Some still scoffed, calling her foolish. But a few began to wonder if one woman could believe in the children. Perhaps they had been wrong to dismiss them as ghosts. One farmer quietly sent a sack of potatoes with Clara. A seamstress donated scraps of fabric for clothing. A carpenter offered to repair one of the mansion's broken doors. These were small gestures, but to the children, they were signs that perhaps the world was beginning to see them too. Trust did not erase hardship. There were still cold nights and empty stomachs, but it changed the way the children carried those burdens. Where once they had endured alone, now they shared their struggles. Where once silence defined them, now they spoke, laughed, learned, and dreamed together. And Clara, too, was transformed. She had entered the mansion thinking she was offering compassion, but she soon realized the children were giving her something in return. Their resilience humbled her, their unity inspired her, and their courage renewed her faith in humanity. By spring, the mansion, though still crumbling, no longer felt like a place of despair. It had become a school, a family, a symbol of endurance. Light poured through broken windows onto children reading aloud, writing words, and sharing meals that Clara helped provide. The mansion was still scarred, but within its walls, hope had taken root. And hope, once planted, has a way of growing beyond its boundaries. By the spring of 1889, the Hargrove Mansion had changed in ways no one could have imagined. It was still cracked and weathered, its roof sagging and windows broken, but inside, something new was alive, voices reciting letters, laughter echoing down once empty corridors, the sound of children daring to dream again. Clara Reynolds had been the spark, but even sparks can only burn so long without fuel. She knew that if the children were to have a real chance, the community itself had to awaken from its silence. It began quietly. A farmer named Mr. Hawkins was the first to soften. One evening he saw Clara carrying a heavy sack up the snowy hill. Curiosity and conscience overcame him. Later, he left a bundle of potatoes and a jug of milk on her doorstep with no note. Clara smiled when she found them. She knew the children would eat heartily that night. Soon after, a seamstress named Mrs. Whitfield began donating scraps of fabric she would have otherwise thrown away. Mary and the girls stitched them into patchwork quilts and sturdy clothing. The children wore these mismatched garments with pride, knowing they were crafted by their own hands. At first, these acts of kindness were done in secret. The townsfolk still carried whispers of the mansion ghosts, but seeing Clara's unwavering devotion began to gnaw at their indifference. One Sunday morning, Clara invited Samuel and Mary to attend church in town. The congregation turned in surprise when the two orphans entered, their clothes patched but clean, their posture nervous but proud. Whispering filled the pews. Yet when Samuel stood beside Clara and recited a psalm he had memorized, the whispers quieted into silence. People saw not ghosts, but children with dignity. The minister, moved by Clara's efforts, spoke that day not of judgment but of responsibility. If we claim to be a community of faith, we cannot let children suffer in shadows. His words struck a chord. Soon others began to visit the mansion. A local carpenter repaired a broken staircase, refusing payment. A doctor volunteered to check on the children's health, bringing remedies for coughs and fevers. Neighbors began sending food, not always much, but enough to remind the children that they were no longer invisible. As the town's eyes opened, the children themselves began to grow in confidence. Where once they had ventured into town with lowered gazes, now they walked upright, carrying books Clara had given them. When people stopped them to ask questions, they answered with clarity and pride. Mary, once shy, began reading her stories aloud during gatherings, her words enchanting both children and adults. Thomas, the young cobbler, began mending shoes for neighbors, earning small coins for his work. Samuel, though still protective, allowed himself to trust others, slowly stepping back from the role of sole provider. For the first time, the children were not merely surviving, they were participating in the life of the town. Not everyone welcomed this change. Some townsfolk muttered that the children were still burdens, that helping them would encourage laziness. Others clung to old superstitions about the mansion being cursed. But Clara countered these doubts not with arguments but with evidence. She invited townspeople to see the children studying, to taste bread baked by their hands, to watch Thomas hammer nails into shoes. She showed them not what the children lacked but what they offered. And slowly, resistance weakened. The children themselves became the strongest argument. Their resilience, their discipline, and their gratitude silenced even the harshest critics. What had once been dismissed as ghosts were now recognized as neighbors, though they had been late to that recognition. By autumn, the mansion had become more than a refuge. It was a symbol of renewal. The townspeople organized a gathering, bringing tools, wood, and paint to restore parts of the building. Broken windows were replaced, the roof patched, and the ballroom, once filled with sorrow, was swept clean and decorated for a harvest feast. That evening, the children sat alongside townsfolk at long tables, sharing bread, laughter, and song. For many, it was the first time they had felt truly part of something larger than themselves. Samuel, seated at the head with Clara, looked around the glowing hall and whispered, "It doesn't feel like we're alone anymore." The mansion's story spread beyond the hill. Visitors from neighboring towns came to see the unusual orphanage that had been born not from government decree, but from compassion. Some donated books, others money, and a few even offered to adopt children. But Samuel, Mary, and the others insisted that while adoption was welcome, the mansion itself must remain, a place where no child would ever again be forgotten. The town, once content to ignore the suffering on its doorstep, had learned a powerful lesson: compassion is contagious. One woman's persistence had awakened their hearts, and the children's resilience had shamed their indifference. Together, they had turned a place of decay into a place of light. By the close of 1889, the Orphans of Hargrove Mansion were no longer spoken of as shadows. They were students, apprentices, storytellers, and helpers. The mansion, though still humble, had become a cornerstone of the town's identity. Clara often said, "The mansion taught us all something. It taught the children that they were worthy of hope. It taught the town that no life is too small to matter. And it taught me that change begins not with power, but with persistence." The community had indeed awakened, not just to the needs of the orphans, but to its own deeper humanity. By the early 1890s, the story of Hargrove Mansion had moved far beyond its crumbling walls. What had once been whispered about as a haunted ruin now stood as a living symbol of renewal. The children, no longer called the mansion ghosts, were growing into young adults with skills, purpose, and dignity. The town, once indifferent, had learned to open its eyes and its heart. But the greatest legacy of the mansion was not in the repaired roof or the books on its shelves. It was in the lessons that endured, lessons that would shape the lives of the orphans and the community for generations to come. The first lesson was resilience. The orphans had endured hunger, cold, illness, and rejection. They had lived through nights of emptiness and mornings of uncertainty. Yet, rather than breaking them, these struggles had forged in them a quiet strength. Samuel, once a boy carrying the burdens of leadership, grew into a man who became a builder. With tools in hand, he repaired homes not only for profit but for families who could not afford repairs. He often said, "I know what it is to live in broken walls. I will not let another child sleep under a leaking roof." His resilience, born in the halls of the mansion, became his life's calling. Mary, who once comforted the younger children with stories, became a teacher. She carried her passion for words into a classroom, where she encouraged children to write their own tales. To her students she would say, "Your voice matters. Even if the world tells you it does not, write it anyway. Speak it anyway." Her resilience was not just survival. It was the courage to inspire. The lesson of resilience was clear: hardship does not define destiny. How one responds to hardship does. The second lesson was compassion. Without Clara Reynolds's courage to act, the children might have remained invisible, but her steady kindness had awakened others, showing that one person's compassion can ripple outward until it transforms an entire community. Years later, townsfolk would recall that change began not with speeches or wealth, but with Clara climbing that hill, basket in hand. She did not save the children with charity alone. She saved them by believing they mattered. Her example taught the town that compassion is not pity. Pity looks down, compassion looks eye to eye. Pity gives leftovers, compassion gives dignity, and dignity, once given, creates hope that endures. The third lesson was unity. The mansion had taught the children that survival was only possible when they carried one another. They shared food, mended clothes, and watched over the sick. That spirit of unity later shaped their adult lives. Thomas, the boy who mended shoes, eventually opened a small workshop. But he never worked alone. He trained other orphans who came after him, teaching them the trade so they could stand on their own feet, literally and figuratively. The community, too, learned unity. Once fractured between those who had plenty and those who had nothing, it discovered the power of shared responsibility. Farmers donated food, carpenters offered labor, mothers volunteered to teach sewing and cooking. Each gift, however small, became part of a larger whole. The mansion's lesson of unity was simple but enduring. When people stand together, no child need be forgotten. The fourth lesson was transformation. Hargrove Mansion itself became a metaphor for human lives. Once abandoned, decayed, and feared, it had been reborn into a place of warmth, learning, and love. So too were the children transformed. They had been written off as burdens, even cursed, yet they grew into farmers, teachers, carpenters, and caregivers. Each one carried scars, yes, but those scars became reminders of what they had overcome. The town, likewise, was transformed. Once silent in the face of suffering, it learned that true strength lies not in turning away, but in facing hardship together. What began as fear of ghosts ended as pride in neighbors. The lesson of transformation showed that no place, no person, is beyond redemption if hope is allowed to take root. Perhaps the most enduring lesson was legacy. The children of Hargrove Mansion did not allow their story to be forgotten. Many of them, as adults, returned to the mansion to help care for new orphans who found their way there. By the turn of the century, the mansion had become not just an orphanage but a school, supported by the very community that had once ignored it. Samuel, Mary, Thomas, and others took turns leading its care, ensuring that no child would ever again lie unseen on the hill. The mansion's halls echoed with songs, lessons, and laughter long after its bricks had begun to crumble. Its true foundation was not stone, but love. The legacy lived on in the stories told to new generations: how once, in 1888, a group of forgotten children survived together, how a teacher climbed a snowy hill, and how a community awoke from indifference. Parents reminded their children, Compassion began here. Don't let it end with us. Looking back, the lesson of the forgotten orphans of Hargrove Mansion was not about tragedy. It was about triumph. It showed that even the most neglected lives can rise when someone dares to care. It proved that communities are not measured by their wealth, but by how they treat their most vulnerable. And it reminded all who heard the tale that compassion, once planted, can endure for centuries. For those who once called it haunted, the mansion became holy ground. Not because of ghosts, but because of the spirit of resilience, compassion, unity, transformation, and legacy that lingered long after the children grew. Even today, the story of Hargrove Mansion whispers a timeless truth. No life is forgotten if we choose to remember. No child is lost if we choose to see, and no community is broken if it chooses to awaken. These are the lessons that endure.